The most useful thing my father ever taught me about navigation is that you can still read a chart that was drawn before you were born. The water doesn't know the card is expired. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how the most important things we carry don't stop being true just because the date has passed. But a woman I'd never met who sat 3 feet from me in a hospital chapel for 2 hours without speaking and quietly rearranged everything I thought I understood about where I'd been going. I didn't know her name then. I didn't know her name for 4 months after. I've been thinking about that too. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 37 years old, and I work as an air traffic controller at Ridgeline Regional, a mid-sized airport in a mid-sized city, where I guide aircraft down through fog, crosswind, and instrument failure approximately 220 times per shift. I am very good at this. Good in the way that means other controllers notice the room when I'm not in it, because something in the air gets slightly less settled. I can hold 23 aircraft in my head simultaneously, anticipate a gate conflict 12 minutes before it happens, and do all of it while sounding like the most certain man alive. What I have not been good at in 37 years is any room that doesn't have a headset in it. My father always said I had a gift for guiding people home. He never mentioned that I'd spend the better part of my adult life struggling to locate the place myself. Some people spend their whole career pointing other people toward their destinations and arrive home every night to find they've been avoiding their own. That is not a metaphor I invented. That is my actual life, described in the flattest possible terms. For almost 9 years, I'd been in a relationship that felt like a frequency I couldn't quite tune. Not broken, not bad, just slightly off in a way you compensate for so gradually that eventually the compensating becomes the relationship, and you mistake the adjustment for the thing itself. Raina ended our engagement in October with a letter she left on the kitchen counter. Thoughtful, thorough, and correct in every particular. I read it 4 times and understood every word, and spent the following 3 days trying to identify which specific distance she meant when she wrote emotional distance, which was probably, as I said, her point. By February, I was in a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 complete set of furniture, a very clean kitchen, and the particular functioning perfectly while feeling nothing competence of a man who has been trained to stay calm while things fall. My father had surgery on a Thursday in March. Not a scare, a surgery. There's a difference that anyone who's been through it understands without needing it explained. A scare you can talk yourself down from in the parking lot. A surgery is you have handed someone you love to a room you cannot follow them into, and now you wait in the only kind of silence that has actual weight to it. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind that passes. The kind that presses. I arrived at Aldermore Hospital at 11:40 p.m. His surgery was already 4 hours in. A nurse named Jeanette, who had the particular gentleness of someone who has delivered hard news so many times that softness has become a professional skill, not just a personal one, told me to find the chapel on the 2nd floor. Quiet up there, she said. And then, carefully, you're not the only one keeping the chairs warm tonight. I didn't understand what she meant until I opened the door. The woman was in the 2nd pew from the back, on the left side. She had a small notebook open on her knee. She wasn't writing in it. She was pressing her thumb slowly along the spiral, binding 1 wire loop at a time in a way that was methodical enough to suggest counting, though I couldn't have told you what. She didn't look up when I came in. Most people look up when a door opens at midnight. It's reflex. She didn't. Not rudely, not deliberately. She was simply somewhere inside herself that my arrival had no call to interrupt. And I sat down in the pew in front of her and understood, without knowing a single thing about her, that this was a woman who had learned how to be present in difficult spaces without asking anything back from them. She had the kind of still that some people perform and some people inhabit. She inhabited it. I sat down. I did not speak. She did not speak. The chapel had the specific quiet of a room that has absorbed too many years of waiting, not peaceful, not religious, the kind that belongs to people who have run out of words and are keeping vigil with their bodies instead. We stayed that way for close to 2 hours. At some point around 1:45 a.m., I got up to find water in the hallway. When I came back, she was gone. The notebook was still in the pew, and I thought briefly about calling after her, then understood that I had no name, no direction, and no reason I could articulate without sounding like something was wrong with me. The notebook disappeared before morning. I assumed she came back for it in the hours I wasn't watching. I did not get her name. I have thought about that specific failure every day for 4 months. The next morning, a hospital volunteer wheeled a flower delivery into my father's room, white dahlias in green paper, slightly battered at the edges, with a handwritten card that read, Room 214, Callahan. Get home soon. We'll fix the rest, T. My father's room was 214. The name on the card was not ours. I stood in the corridor outside his door and held someone else's flowers for longer than the situation warranted. Not because I wanted to keep them, not because I was confused about whose they were, because the name Nora Callahan was specific enough and the handwriting was familiar enough in its deliberateness to belong to a woman who had counted wire loops in a dark chapel for 2 hours and never asked me why I was there. I returned the flowers to the nurse's station, told them the room assignment was wrong. I did not ask which room they belonged to. I've turned that over in my head more times than I can account for. I was a man trained to track things precisely, a man whose job description is literally do not lose anything. And I stood in a hospital hallway holding a woman's name and her white dahlias and chose, for reasons I still can't fully defend, to put them down and walk away. I've been working on understanding that about myself. I haven't finished yet. What I know now that I didn't then, Nora Callahan is a forensic document restorer. She works for a private archive that contracts with universities and historical societies when something old and irreplaceable has been damaged, burned, water-soaked, partially destroyed, and someone needs to recover what was written before anyone tried to erase it. She repairs documents by understanding what they were before the damage. She reads impressions left in margins. She recovers meaning from the space between what remains and what was written over. She'd been at Aldermore that night because her mother had a stroke. Same wing, 2 floors up from my father. Nora drove 4 hours from the city, arrived at 10 p.m., was told her mother was stable and resting, and went to the chapel because she told me this months later in the specific tone people use when they're admitting something small that isn't. It was the only room in the building that didn't ask anything of her. She also told me much later in that same careful tone that she'd recognized my last name when the flowers were delivered to her mother's room by mistake. Webb. She'd seen it on my father's door when she came back for her notebook at 3 a.m. She didn't come find me either. I don't know exactly what that means. I know it means something. My father was discharged 8 days after the surgery. Irritable, opinionated, and entirely himself, which is the best possible outcome I know how to hope for. On the afternoon he was discharged in the hospital parking lot, he pressed something into my palm the way he does when he's made a decision about you that you don't get a vote in. It was a small laminated card, wallet-sized, but thicker than a business card, the kind of thing that was made to last. Tide table for Harrow Harbor, it said, printed 1987. The dates were decades expired. The ink along one edge had faded where the laminate had begun to lift at the corner from years of being handled. You've had this since I started, before you were born. He said, simply, I carried it through your mother's pregnancy, through the winter I don't talk about, through every flight I took that felt like it might be my last. He pressed my fingers closed around it. The channels in that harbor haven't moved since they printed this card. Old guidance is still guidance. The water runs the same way it always has. I've been a controller for 11 years. I understand navigation the way other people understand breathing. I knew exactly what he meant. I put the card in my wallet, behind my license, where it has been every day since. I think he was talking about my broken engagement, about the apartment with one set of furniture, about the clean kitchen and the quiet that had no warmth in it. He might have been talking about Nora. I didn't know yet that those were the same conversation. That was March. The reunion was in June. I had 4 reasons not to go. The first was that Raina would be there, my ex-fiancée, 8 months out, presumably with someone new, and the whole room quietly taking notes on how I handled it. The second was that I had nothing to prove to a ballroom full of people I hadn't thought about in 15 years. The third and fourth were vaguer than that, but I have learned to trust a vague reason when I have 2 of them. Then my friend Derek called me on a Wednesday night and said, Nora Callahan's going. She told Jana, and Jana told me. I figured you'd want to know. I held the phone for a moment without answering. Marcus? Yeah, I said. I heard you. I sat with that information for 3 days, turned it over like the tide table card, running my thumb along the edge of something that felt important without being able to say why. Not because I had a plan, not because showing up would mean anything, not because I had decided anything at all, because some part of me had been sitting in that chapel for 4 months, pressing my thumb along a spiral binding, waiting for the door to open again. I texted Derek, I'll be there. I should have paid more attention to how she held her exit. I would have recognized it sooner. I have a professional habit that makes social events difficult, which is that I walk into every room the same way I walk into a shift. I inventory it. Exits first, not because I'm anxious, just because knowing where the edges are is how I orient to any space. Then the anchors, load-bearing elements, things that won't move. Then the variables, everything in motion, everything with the potential to become a problem. I've been doing this since my first year in the tower. My ex-fiance used to say it made her feel like she was being approached by air traffic rather than by a person. She wasn't wrong. It was one of the things we never successfully argued about. I walked into the Hartwell Hotel ballroom on a Friday night in June and ran my standard inventory in about 45 seconds. 2 main exits, 1 service door, 1 emergency stair, bar anchored to the far left wall. Catering table, opposite. Roughly 90 people, most of them former versions of themselves dressed in what success was supposed to look like from the outside. Music low enough to talk over, loud enough to avoid silence. A photo display near the entrance, 15 years of reunions. Photos of people I remembered being 18 and now couldn't place in a crowd. Raina was near the photo display with a man I didn't recognize. I registered this the same way I register a light aircraft on an adjacent heading. Noted, tracked, not my immediate concern. Nora was standing 8 feet from the bar, not at it. I noticed her before Derek noticed I'd arrived, which meant I had approximately 12 seconds alone with the observation before it became a performance. She was holding a glass of white wine she hadn't touched. Her coat was still over her arm, not draped on a chair, not checked at the door, but folded over her forearm with the deliberateness of someone who has decided in advance to keep that option available. She was facing the room, but her body was angled very slightly, barely enough for most people to catch toward the emergency exit on the south wall. I filed that away without understanding it yet. What I understood was that she was the same person who had sat in the chapel. I was certain of that before she turned her face toward me. There was something in how she inhabited the crowd the same way she'd inhabited the quiet, not performing presence, just exercising it. Like the room was a document she was reading rather than a situation she was navigating. Derek appeared at my elbow with the particular energy of a man who has decided his primary role for the evening is social architecture. Marcus, he said, already steering, Nora Callahan. She turned. Her eyes moved to my face, and something passed through them that was quick and specific and almost entirely contained. Not surprise, more like a measurement completed. We haven't officially met, she said. Her voice was lower than I'd expected. Even, I know your name. Same, I said. Derek looked between us with the baffled optimism of a man who has no idea what he's witnessing. He made a joke, something about how the 2 quietest people at the reunion had found each other, which he seemed to think was funny. Nora gave him a smile that started in her eyes and stopped there, polite and final as a period, at the end of a sentence. Derek drifted towards someone who'd laugh harder. He means well, she said. He does. I agreed. He also thought we'd never met. We haven't. The smallest pause. Not officially. She said the last word the same way I'd said it, not as an echo, as an acknowledgement. I noticed that too. Raina found our corner of the room 20 minutes later. I don't think it was accidental. The room had a certain gravitational pull to it that night, people moving in arcs designed to cross at specific points, catching each other's periphery and pretending it was coincidence. I'd been tracking it all evening the way I track weather systems, visible from far enough out that nothing should be a surprise. What I hadn't anticipated was the particular warmth Raina wore to these encounters. Not cruelty. Raina was never cruel. She was precise, which is more durable. She arrived with her boyfriend tall, comfortable in the room, in a way that suggested he'd spent most of his life being comfortable in rooms, and greeted me with a hug that was exactly the right length. Then she turned to Nora with a smile that reached her eyes, which is exactly the thing you notice when it's not quite reaching something deeper. I don't think we've met. Raina said. Are you here with Marcus? We came separately, Nora said. Oh, Raina's smile adjusted by approximately nothing. I think someone mentioned you restore documents, manuscripts or something? Historical documents, mostly archives. That sounds fascinating. She said it the way people say that sounds complicated to something they've already dismissed. Then she turned back to me, and the boyfriend said something to someone across the room. And Raina said, Marcus, you look well. And then the group pulled her away with the efficiency of a current, and she was gone. The whole exchange lasted less than 90 seconds. Beside me, Nora took a small sip of her wine, set the glass on the nearest flat surface, said nothing. You don't have to say it, I told her. I wasn't going to say anything. You were deciding whether it would be useful. She looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating something. Is that what I look like? That's what you look like. A beat. Then something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but in that direction, surprised into almost existence before she could manage it. The first real thing I'd seen on her face all night. It vanished. She glanced toward the south wall, not at anything specific, just at the wall. The moment happened about 40 minutes later, near the edge of the room, during a conversation that had accumulated the way bad weather accumulates gradually. Then, all at once, there were 6 of us in the cluster. Derek, his wife Jana, a woman named Brooke who I'd known slightly in school, her husband, and the 2 of us. Someone had pulled Raina back into the orbit, and she was talking to Brooke with the fluid ease of a person who is never once worried about whether the room is paying attention, because the room always is. The conversation was moving through occupations. Everyone cycling through the clean version of what they did, the version that reads well at a 15-year reunion. When it reached Nora, she said document restoration, historical archives, clear, complete, not performing. Raina said pleasantly, oh, that's right, Marcus brought you tonight, didn't he? His +1. There was nothing aggressive in her tone. That was the precision of it. It was said warmly, in the same voice you'd use to say, oh, they're together, how sweet. And it landed in the group like something dropped from just enough height to make a sound without breaking anything. Nora's chin lifted by a fraction. Not hurt, something more contained than hurt. I felt my hand move before I decided to move it. I reached into my wallet. Not slowly, not dramatically, the way you reach for something you've been carrying so long that finding it requires no thought. I took out the tide table card, small and laminated and older than anyone in the room was expecting, and I held it out to Nora. I didn't explain it, didn't frame it, didn't look at Raina. When I did it, Nora looked at the card, then at me. She took it. The group had the specific quality of a room where the conversation has just stopped making sense to everyone present. Derek's mouth was open by approximately 1 centimeter. Jana blinked. Raina's smile held its shape, but the warmth went out of it, in the way warmth goes out of things when the source is removed. Nora turned the card over in her fingers, read the front, looked at the faded dates. Her thumb moved over the lifted corner of the laminate, the same motion. I realized with a shock I kept entirely off my face, as the spiral binding in the chapel. The same methodical pressure, like she was reading it through her hands. Then she looked up at me. You didn't have to do that, she said. Her voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. I know, I said. She held my gaze for a moment in the way a person holds something while deciding whether to put it down. Then she slid the card into the front pocket of her jacket. That was the end of the conversation, as far as the group was concerned. Someone said something about the music. Brooke's husband laughed too loudly. The current moved on. Raina didn't look at me again that night, which told me everything her smile had been careful not to. An hour later, I found Nora near one of the tall windows at the back of the room. The city lights were doing their ordinary work outside. She was still holding her coat. You're about to leave, I said. She glanced at me sideways. What makes you say that? I nodded at the coat. You haven't put that down once tonight. A brief silence, the slightly loaded kind. Not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. I drove myself, she said. I like being able to leave when I want. Where are you parked? Down the block. A pause. Why? I'm not asking you to stay, I said. I'm asking if you have a minute before you go. She considered this with the same unhurried attention she'd applied to the tide table card. Then she turned to face the window, which I took as a yes. How did you end up at Hartwell? She asked. You didn't go to school here. My mother sighed. I spent high school at Ridgeline, but summer's here. Derek's people are here. I glanced at her. How did you? My mother's here. A short pause. She's been at Aldermore since March. She said it evenly, the way people say things they have rehearsed into flatness. I've been coming back weekends. I'm sorry. She's improving. Not a deflection exactly, but a door closing gently rather than slamming. Your father was there that night, too. He was. I looked at her. I found your flowers. Her chin moved slightly. I know. The nurse told me. She said someone returned them. She paused. She didn't say, it was you. I didn't ask for credit. No, she said. Slowly. You wouldn't. I didn't know what to do with that sentence. It arrived with the weight of something observed over a long time, which made no sense given that she'd known my name for 4 months and my face for an hour. But there are people you feel like you've been knowing longer than the calendar allows, and I had the specific uncomfortable recognition of standing beside one of them. Nora's hand went to her jacket pocket. She pressed her fingers against the card through the fabric, not reaching for it, just confirming it was still there. What is it? She asked. The card, a tide table. My father gave it to me. It's expired by about 30 years. Yeah, and you carry it anyway. The harbor hasn't moved, I said. She was quiet for a moment, not empty quiet, the kind of quiet that's working on something. That's a very specific thing to say, she said finally. He was a very specific man. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary patient way. Nora watched it. I watched her watch it. Her coat stayed on her arm. Her body, I noticed, was still angled, not toward the south exit this time, but toward the window. I couldn't tell if that was better or the same thing, wearing different clothes. I should go, she said. Okay. She turned to look at me. Something in her face was doing a calculation she hadn't finished. The card, she said. Can I keep it tonight? Not keep it. Tonight? Yeah. I said, I'll give it back. I know, I said. And I did know, which was the part I held on to after she left. Not the moment with Raina, not the way the room had gone briefly quiet, not even the card. The certainty that she would come back with it. The specific way a person holds something they intend to return. She walked toward the south exit with her coat still over her arm. I watched until the door closed. Then I went to find Derek, because I needed someone to talk to who would ask me the wrong questions. I needed time to figure out what the right ones were. She texted me on a Tuesday, not the day after the reunion, not that Sunday. Tuesday giving us both the weekend to process, which I found either considerate or self-protective, and couldn't decide which mattered more. The message was short. I still have your card. Are you at Aldermore this Saturday? My father had a follow-up appointment that Saturday. I had already planned to be there. I wrote back yes. Cafeteria on the second floor, around 11. She replied with nothing but the time confirmed. I spent the intervening 4 days doing what I do when I'm managing something. I kept busy in a very organized way. I picked up 2 extra shifts. I reorganized the cabinet above my stove. I called my father 3 times, which was once more than usual, and listened to him talk about the neighbor's dog with more attention than the subject warranted. On Thursday night, I sat on my couch with a book open on my lap and read the same paragraph 11 times, and then put the book down and admitted to myself what I was doing, which was waiting. I hadn't been waiting for anything in a long time. It was inconvenient to discover that I'd missed it. Aldermore's second floor cafeteria had the particular quality of hospital, common spaces, worn linoleum, good light from wide windows, coffee that was better than it had any right to be. I arrived 7 minutes early, which I hadn't planned but didn't fight. Nora arrived at exactly 11, in jeans and a gray sweater, still carrying a bag over one shoulder with the practiced efficiency of someone who packs light and on purpose. She sat down across from me and put the tide table card on the table between us, face up. She'd kept it in something, a book, maybe because it was slightly flatter than it had been. The lifted corner of the laminate pressed gently back into place. I noticed that without comment. Thank you, I said, for returning what I borrowed, for taking it. She considered that. looked out the window at the parking structure across the way, the mid-morning sky behind it. "How's your father?" she asked. "Better every week." I wrapped both hands around my coffee, impossible to convince of this fact. Her mouth moved, not a smile yet. Something preparatory. "My mother asked me to bring her reading glasses from home," she said. "I drove 4 hours and she asked me to bring reading glasses over in the bag. I packed. I stood in her room with the bag in my hands and she said, 'I told you to bring them.' I said, 'I did bring them.' She said, 'But did you know you'd brought them?' And that," she paused, "is what it is to have my mother recovering." I laughed, more than the anecdote required. She glanced at me with that same recalibrating expression from the reunion, measuring something she had expected to be different from what it turned out to be. "You laugh fast," she said. "You tell good stories. I tell factual accounts of difficult situations. That's what a good story is." She did smile then. The real kind, the kind that arrived slowly, like she'd been deciding whether to let it, and then lost the argument with herself. It was the first time I'd seen it without anything in front of it. The polite version, the almost version. This was the thing itself, and it rearranged the light in the room in a way I was glad I was sitting down for. We stayed for nearly 2 hours. I don't remember all of what we talked about, which is unusual for me. I have a professional memory for detail, call signs, routing numbers, weather minimums, down to the decimal. But that morning went soft at the edges in a way I couldn't account for, like trying to recall music. What I have is impressions. She talked about a manuscript she was currently restoring, damaged in a flood. The ink bloomed outward from a waterline, so the text ran into its own margins. She said that the most legible part was often what was written between the lines, because the primary text had spread too far to read. I said that sounded like most conversations I'd ever had. She said, "Yes, that's why I prefer documents." I watched her hands when she talked about her work. She moved them the way people move when they love the thing they're describing, not performatively, just naturally animated, like the subject called up the motion without asking. At some point, she said, "You listen like you're landing something." I looked at her. I mean that as a compliment. She said, "Slightly careful, like whatever I'm saying is coming in on approach and you're talking it down, tracking it, making sure it arrives intact." The sentence sat between us with more weight than she'd probably meant to give it. "Most people don't know they're doing that," I said. "Doing what?" "Describing exactly the thing they want." Her hand was resting on the table near the tide table card. She didn't move it. Neither did I. The cafeteria moved around us in its ordinary morning way, trays, footsteps, the low institutional hum of a building that never entirely quiets. But the specific 6 inches of table between her hand and mine had the quality of something suspended, not uncomfortable, the loaded kind of quiet, the kind where both people have stopped pretending the silence is accidental. Neither of us moved for a long moment. Then she pulled her coffee toward her, and the moment closed without breaking. "I should check on my mother," she said. "Of course." She gathered her bag, stood, looked at the card still on the table. "Keep it," she said. "It's mine." "I know." A pause, something unfinished in it. I just wanted to say it. She left. I watched her go because I could not watch her go, not because I was hoping she'd turn around, but because she had a way of moving through a space that I was apparently incapable of not tracking. At the cafeteria door, she paused, not to look back, just to shift her bag on her shoulder. Then she was gone. I sat with my hands around a cold coffee cup and picked up the tide table card. Not because I needed to hold something, because I needed a minute before I was ready to be anywhere else. I spent a week being very sensible. I texted her twice, once to say I hoped her mother was doing better, once to share a photo of a tide table framed on the wall of a bar I'd walked past, which I sent with no comment. She responded to both, the first warmly, the second with a single line. Someone understood the assignment that made me smile in a parking lot for longer than dignity allowed. That was the extent of it. In between, I was careful. I worked my shifts. I called my father. I went to the gym on Wednesday and stood in the parking lot afterward in the particular days of someone who has exercised their body while their mind did something else entirely. I was not pining. I want to be precise about that. It wasn't longing in the way people mean when they mean restless and dramatic. It was more like when you've been calibrating to a frequency for a long time and suddenly you don't have to work at it anymore. And the absence of effort is the thing you can't stop noticing. My coworker, Randall, had been in love with someone for 6 years. I know this because everyone in the tower knows this. It's the kind of thing that becomes ambient over time, like the hum of the equipment, something you stop hearing until one day you hear it again fresh. Randall had been in love with a woman named Petra, who worked in ground operations, and he had been careful about it for 6 years. Careful in his texts, careful in his proximity, careful in the way he never asked for anything directly, so he'd never have to hear a direct no. That week, I watched him across the tower floor doing a version of careful that I recognized from the outside for the first time. He looked like a man who had made himself very small in a space he deserved to fill. I understood why. I also understood, standing there in the blue-white light of the radar screens, that understanding a thing and repeating it were two different choices. On Friday, I took the tide table card out of my wallet, held it for a moment. The harbor doesn't care that the card is old. The channels haven't moved. I put it back. I wasn't ready to move yet, but I was beginning to understand that not ready and won't were becoming different words. Theo Marsh had been Nora's closest friend since they were 19. I know this now. What I knew then was that the name on the flower card was T, and that when he approached me at the edge of the reunion's second act, he had the specific manner of a man who has made up his mind in his acting before he can think better of it. I'd seen him briefly earlier in the evening, tall, slightly restless, the kind of person who attends events by moving through them at a steady pace rather than settling. He'd spoken to Nora twice that I'd tracked, both times briefly, and each time she'd touched his arm in a way that meant old and trusted and nothing else. I hadn't been jealous. I'd noticed I wasn't jealous, which told me something about what I actually felt. He found me near the bar around 10:30. His jacket was off. He held his glass in a way that suggested he'd been deciding whether to have this conversation for a while. "I'm Theo," he said. "I've known Nora since she accidentally destroyed my philosophy dissertation and spent 3 weeks helping me recover it." He paused. The recovering was her idea. The destroying was also her idea, but she maintains it was an accident. "Marcus," I said. "She's mentioned you." "She mentioned me?" He seemed genuinely surprised. "She doesn't mention people." I didn't say anything to that. Theo looked toward the south exit, where Nora had been standing some 20 minutes earlier before Jan from the catering team had pulled her into a conversation. "She bought a new dress for tonight," he said. He said it plainly, without ornamentation. "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. I have known Nora Callahan for 11 years. She doesn't come to dinners. She doesn't come to parties or birthdays or any event that requires her to stay until a thing is finished. She shows up to openings and leaves before the speeches. She buys tickets and loses them in her bag. She has 7 event invitations on her refrigerator with the date circled that she has not gone to." He took a small sip of his drink. "She drove 4 hours for a 15-year reunion at a school she didn't attend. She bought a new dress. She had your card in her jacket pocket the entire night." He looked at me steadily. "I'm not telling you this for your sake. I'm telling you because whatever you did or didn't do, I need you to understand what it costs her to walk through a door instead of standing outside one." He wasn't threatening me. He wasn't asking me to perform something. He was doing what people who love someone do when they've watched that person be careful for too long. He was handing me information and trusting me to know what to do with it. I thought about her coat, her body angled toward the south exit. "I like being able to leave when I want. I know she leaves," I said. Theo was quiet for a moment, then something in his posture changed by a fraction, not quite relief, something earlier than relief, like confirmation. "Good," he said. "Then you understand that she didn't." He moved away before I could answer. I stood at the bar with my drink and the evening turning around me and the specific sensation of a sentence landing somewhere deeper than it was supposed to. She didn't. The room continued its ordinary reunion business. People laughing. Someone giving a toast near the photo display. The music low and slightly nostalgic, the way music is at events designed to make you feel like time has been kind. I looked toward the south exit. Nora was standing 4 feet from it, talking to Jana. Her coat was still on her arm. She hadn't left. I stayed with that for exactly as long as I needed to. Then I walked toward her Jana said something to Nora, laughed at her own joke, and drifted back toward the bar. For a brief moment, the two of us were alone in the noise with the south exit 4 feet away and the rest of the reunion doing its best not to look like it was watching. You want to step outside? I said. She glanced at the terrace door. Yes, she said. Just that. June had left a warm edge on the city, the kind that arrives in evenings and makes outdoor spaces feel borrowed from somewhere better. The hotel terrace overlooked a side street, parked cars, a cafe with its lights still on, ordinary life going about its business below. Nora stood at the railing with her coat over her arm. I stood beside her and let the reunion noise soften behind the glass. Theo talked to you, she said. Not a question. He did. She was quiet for a moment in the calculating way I had started to recognize, not distant, working. What did he say? That you bought a new dress. I paused. That you don't buy new dresses. She looked down at the street. Something moved in her jaw. Theo has always had very strong opinions about what I do and don't do. Is he wrong? A beat? Then no. The street below was doing its ordinary work. Somewhere, a door opened and closed. She pressed her thumb along the strap of her bag one slow pass, and I thought about the spiral binding in the chapel, about a woman who counts things when she's deciding what to do next. I had my car keys in my pocket the whole night, she said. I was going to leave at 9, then 9:30. Then she stopped. I don't stand near exits. I don't know what to do with myself when I'm not leaving. I didn't say anything right away. The silence between us had weight to it, not uncomfortable, not empty. The kind that comes after someone has handed you something breakable and is watching to see how you hold it. Your coat is still on your arm, I said. She looked at it. Yeah, I'm not asking you to put it down. She turned to look at me then, and whatever she found was unexpected enough to change the quality of her expression. What are you asking? She said. Nothing right now. I'm just letting you know I can see it there. She blinked once, a physical tell that happens before a person decides whether to say the honest thing. Then she said, quietly, almost to herself, I recognized your name on the flowers. In March. I knew it was you. The city moved below us. I know, I said. You came back for the notebook at 3 a.m. I think you stood in the hallway for a while before you went in. She stared at me. I'm guessing. I looked at her. But I think you did. She looked away. Not hurt, caught. There is a difference. And she was too precise to pretend otherwise. I'm not good at this, she said. At what? At staying in things. I'm good at arriving. I'm good at the beginning of things, the part where everything's still provisional and no one has made a promise that can be broken. She paused. I have a friend who says I live my whole life like I'm reading a document with the last page missing. I don't finish things. I leave before the cost is clear. Not because she didn't care about things, not because she was careless, because she had learned somewhere back in the part of her life I didn't know yet, that the ending of something always came and that being present for it was a pain she had gotten very efficient at avoiding. I took the tide table card out of my wallet. I didn't hand it to her. I set it on the stone railing between us in the thin light from the hotel windows and left it there. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached out slowly and set 2 fingers on it, not picking it up, just touching it. The faded dates, the lifted corner. Old guidance, I said. She didn't answer, but her hand didn't move. I reached over and covered it with mine. She looked at her hands, then up at me. Then she turned her hand over, deliberately, and held mine back. The kind of quiet that followed was not nothing. It was the specific silence of 2 people who have stopped pretending the distance between them was accidental. An hour later, the reunion was folding in on itself the way they do, loosened jackets, moved chairs, the low energy of an event that has run its course. We'd stayed on the terrace for most of it, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't. And the talking had the quality I'd been carrying in the back of my head since a hospital cafeteria. Easy in the way it's easy when 2 people have stopped managing the conversation and are just in it. Eventually she said, I should get my car. I'll walk you. We went through the lobby, past the late stage reunion, the goodbyes, the promises to stay in touch that both parties understand are provisional. Outside, the sidewalk was wet from a brief rain that had come and gone while we were inside. The street lamps turned the pavement silver. Her car was 3 blocks down. We walked without talking, which was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. At her car, she stopped, took out her keys, didn't use them yet. She looked at me in the specific way of someone who has been working toward a decision all evening and has finally arrived at its edge. I want to be honest with you, she said. Okay, I've thought about you since March, since the chapel. Before I knew anything about you except that you sat still in a hard room and didn't try to make it smaller with conversation. She paused. I don't say things like that to people. I want you to understand, this is not a thing I say. She took one step closer. I'm done not saying it, she said. She kissed me the way people make a decision they've been turning over long enough to know its exact weight. Her hand came to my jaw, first slow, deliberate, giving me every second to understand what was happening. I brought my hands to her face and kissed her back with the full attention of a man who has been tracking something for a long time and is finally allowed to hold still. When she pulled back, she stayed close. Not triumphant. Something quieter than that, something that had been held too long and was only now releasing. Her forehead came to rest at the edge of my jaw. Her breath was unsteady in a way she wasn't trying to hide. I said I wasn't going anywhere. She said, I know. I just needed to make sure I wasn't either. The wet street held the lamplight around us. The city moved in its indifferent way. For one specific minute, none of it reached us. 3 Sundays later, her car was in my parking lot at 8 a.m. Not the morning after, I want to be clear about that. Because the version of this where everything collapses into ease and certainty overnight would be a story about different people. What we were was careful, and careful in practice meant one dinner, one long phone call that I can still locate by feel, 2 Saturdays at Aldermore that started at the hospital and ended somewhere better, and a series of texts that had gradually stopped performing neutrality. Not because we were slow, because we were paying attention. 3 Sundays in, she knocked on my door holding a bag of groceries with the expression of someone who has made a decision and isn't entirely sure how it will land. I thought I'd cook, she said. If that's all right. You could have texted first. I know. She held up the bag. I didn't want to give myself the chance to talk myself out of it. I opened the door. She cooked eggs with the specific confidence of someone who has opinions about eggs that may not be supported by the eggs themselves. I made coffee. We moved around the kitchen in the tentative way of 2 people learning each other's geometry, apologizing when we reached for the same cabinet, laughing at the apologies. It was ordinary in a way that felt deliberate. Not something we'd fallen into, something we were choosing. One small decision at a time. Halfway through breakfast, she went quiet, not distant, just somewhere inside herself, looking at the window over the sink. Her fork set down with a small click. I'd started to learn what that quality of quiet meant, not comfortable, not loaded, the calculating kind, the kind where she's running the numbers on something she isn't sure she should say. I think I'm going to mess this up, she said. Not dramatically. The way she'd note water damage on a document, an honest assessment, not a catastrophe. I waited. Not on purpose. Not because I don't want this. She picked up her fork, set it back down. I have a pattern. I get to the point where something's good and I find a reason to leave before it costs me anything. I'm telling you so you know what you're dealing with, not so you'll fix it. I just think it's fair. I thought about the card on the railing, old guidance, the channels unchanged. Nora, I said. She looked at me. You drove here without texting. A beat? Yeah, she said. That was the mess up. I held her gaze. And you knocked anyway. She looked at me for a long moment in the clear Sunday morning light that doesn't flatter anything and shows exactly what's there. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it. Okay, she said. Okay, I said. She picked up her fork. Outside. The Sunday did its unhurried work. Inside, we finished breakfast at a table in a kitchen that was beginning to know us both, and the morning had the quality of something neither of us was hurrying toward the end of. She didn't ask for her coat until she was ready to leave. That time, when the door closed behind her, I didn't watch it. I turned back and started washing the dishes. 3 weeks after that Sunday, I was in the tower on a Tuesday afternoon shift when I realized I hadn't tracked a single exit in 4 hours. Not the stairwell door, not the emergency release on the west side, Not the service exit I'd been clocking since my first week at Ridgeline Regional, out of a habit I'd never examined closely enough to name. 23 aircraft, one developing crosswind at runway 2-7, a late push from gate 11 that I'd seen coming 8 minutes out. None of my attention had gone, even once, to the edges of the room. I noticed the absence the way you notice when a sound you've been hearing for years finally stops. I didn't say anything to anyone. I worked the rest of my shift. I drove home. I texted Nora. I think I stopped doing a thing today. She replied, "Tell me at dinner." I did. She listened with the quality of attention that I had decided over recent weeks was the thing I would most want from another person for the rest of my life. Though I hadn't said that out loud yet and wasn't planning to for a while. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the thinking kind of silence, not the calculating kind, not the weighted kind, the one that comes before she says something true. "Sounds like you trusted the instruments," she said. "Yeah," I said. Something like that. 3 months after the Sunday, I opened my wallet to pay for coffee and found the tie table card in its usual place, behind my license. I had taken it out a dozen times since the terrace. I knew every detail of it. But the lifted corner of the laminate, the edge that had been peeling back from years of handling, was lying flat, sealed, as precise as a repaired margin. She had fixed it at some point without mentioning it. Not because she thought it needed to be announced, because she notices damage and she fixes it. That is who she is. It is the thing she does without asking whether anyone is watching. I stood in the coffee shop with the card in my hand for longer than I needed to, and then I put it back where it lived and didn't say anything about it until that evening, when I told her I'd noticed. She shrugged. The laminate was lifting. I had the right adhesive. "Nora, it's a conservation technique. It took 4 minutes. Thank you," I said. She looked at me sideways. "You're welcome," she said, as if I was making too much of it. She was making too little of it. That is the distance between us that I have stopped trying to close because I think it might be the most important thing about her. 6 months after the Sunday, I saw Raina at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning. Not a collision, a passing. She was ahead of me in line at a produce stand, and she turned, and we saw each other at the same time. And for a moment, we both made the calculations that people make when they share a history. Then she gave me a small, genuine smile, nothing polished in it, just real, and said, "You look good, Marcus." I said she did too. She moved on. Her boyfriend was waiting with the bags. I watched her go for exactly 1 second. Then Nora appeared at my elbow and held up 2 bunches of basil. "Which one?" she said. "Looks more like it has reasons to live." I looked at the basil. I looked at her, slightly windblown, a smear of something on her wrist from her morning work, already moving on to the next decision with the specific forward momentum that I had come to understand was how she experienced being alive, not restless, directed. "Left one," I said. "Wrong. Right one. You can tell by the stems." She put the left one back. "Also, I need your opinion on a tomato situation that's getting complicated." I followed her away from the stand without looking back once, not because Raina didn't matter, not because the history didn't exist, or because I'd revised it into something neater than it was, because the person walking ahead of me was pointing at a tomato with an expression of genuine professional concern, and the room, the old room, the one that had always been watching for my reaction, had simply become less interesting than whatever she was about to say. Here is what it cost. For almost a year after Raina left, I made myself small in a very organized way. I worked extra shifts. I called my father. I kept the kitchen clean. I was functional and capable and completely absent from my own life. And I told myself that was recovery, when what it actually was a man who had learned to confuse available with present and was doing it on purpose. I almost stayed there, not because it felt good, because it felt known. Because being careful is something you can do indefinitely, and being seen is something that requires you to stop. What Nora risked was different. She had built an entire architecture around the door she could leave through. 11 years of arriving early and going before the last song, of circling events on a refrigerator calendar that she never quite attended, of being brilliant at beginnings and unavailable for endings. She had made it a system. She was good at it. It worked. She drove to a hotel reunion at a school she didn't attend, bought a dress she didn't need, and stood 4 feet from the exit for 3 hours. I don't know exactly what that cost her. She hasn't given me all the rooms yet, and I'm not asking for keys I haven't been handed. What I know is that when she finally told me in pieces over months of ordinary Sundays and late phone calls and the gradual work of becoming legible to each other, she didn't make it small. She said, I knew it was you in March. I knew in June. I've known for a while what kind of person you are. That's not nothing to admit, and it's not nothing to act on. She was right. It isn't nothing. Neither of us is exactly who we were before this started. Not transformed, not fixed, just slightly reoriented. He turns toward things now more than away from them. She stays for the endings of things, not all of them, but more. And the ones she stays for, she inhabits fully in a way. I am still getting used to being the recipient of. One Wednesday morning, I found her at the kitchen table with a damaged ledger spread under the good light, working in the particular silence she makes when she's deep inside something, careful and still and entirely present. She didn't look up when I came in, but she reached back with one hand without turning, 2 fingers extended, and patted the chair beside her. I sat down. So let me tell you what the story was actually about. It wasn't about the reunion. It wasn't about Raina or the chapel or an expired tide table from a harbor I've never seen. It was about a man who was very good at guiding other people home and had spent the better part of a decade treating his own life like a flight he wasn't quite cleared to land. I was waiting for certainty, for the right conditions, for someone to confirm that the runway was clear and the visibility was adequate and every variable was in acceptable range before I committed to the approach. What I learned, what Nora showed me, not in words, but in the specific act of a woman who leaves things driving 4 hours and knocking on a door anyway, is that the approach doesn't wait for perfect conditions. You read the instruments you have. You trust the training. You bring it in. Some people leave before they can be left. I used to call that self-protection. I know now it's just a longer way of being alone. Staying, it turns out, takes more courage. She is currently in my kitchen arguing with a document from 1943 that she says is being deliberately difficult. In a few minutes, I'll make coffee and she'll tell me what the document is hiding. And I'll listen the way she once said, I listen like whatever she's saying is coming in and I'm talking it down, making sure it arrives intact. The tide table card is in my wallet. The channels haven't moved. And I want to ask you something. If you had been sitting in that chapel, if the person who walked in was someone you weren't expecting in a moment when neither of you had anything left to perform, would you have spoken first? Would you have asked her name before she slipped back out the door? Or would you have told yourself there would be another moment, a better moment, a moment with fewer variables and cleaner conditions? Because I think most of us know exactly what we would have done. And I think most of us know what it cost. Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the chapel moment you didn't take, or the one you did, or the one you're still standing next to, pretending you haven't decided. I read every single one. If this story felt like something you needed today, share it with someone who might need it too. You probably already know who that is. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because next time, we're talking about what happens when the person who walked away comes back. And you have to decide whether the door you built was a wall or a window. I'll see you there.